it's my role today to say good afternoon and welcome you warmly to our symposium. I'm Debs Robinson. I'm a Professor of Inclusive Education and Special Educational Needs at the University of Derby. And on behalf of the University of Derby and the University of Southampton, I'm delighted to invite you all, including our contributors and our large international audience, to this symposium. So a big warm welcome. So today in our symposium, the question we're posing is an important one, and it is: how can we and how can education catalyse the social inclusion of people with learning disabilities? And this is a question which was also explored in our special issue of the British Journal of Learning Disabilities, and the issue had the same theme. So when it comes down to it, what the special issue and this symposium today is exploring is how education in all its varied forms, whether that's schooling, at college, in the workplace, in the community, can work to make social inclusion better for people with learning disabilities. And of course, the work of Geraldine Leader, who I'm pleased to say is here with us today, and Stacy, Simplican and their colleagues has been really important in helping us to define and debate what better social inclusion actually means. So from this perspective, better means growth in the range of sites of participation, e.g. moving from family to workplace to civic activism, and it also means growth in the quality of relationships in those sites, meaning that those relationships are longer term, perhaps more formal in the context of employment relationships, and also more reciprocal. So better social inclusion then is about growth in breadth and depth of participation. So if education is to support better social inclusion, it means that education's gaze will need to shift to the real world spaces where the real world participation is to take place. So, for example, the workplaces, the communities, and the sites for independent living. And this is likely to involve, in education, forms of preparatory education for individuals, such as co-constructed programs of skills development, as well as education like teaching, mentoring and coaching, unfolding within the site of participation itself. And it will also involve questions about how educators can work with organisations and people within the sites of those sites of participation, for example, workplaces, supported internships, so that the organisations themselves are more inclusive and allow social inclusion to unfold with all its benefits. So, in other words, education and the work of educators for social inclusion, and indeed of educational researchers, is no longer to be bounded in schools and colleges. It's got to spread out into workplaces and communities where that participation is happening. So our presenters today will offer some compelling and evidenced reflections on these issues of social inclusion, and they will share what they found out from their own research about how education can make social inclusion better or indeed worse. So I'd really like to thank Vasilis, Jerry and Eleni, who were all co-editors for the special issue. And I'd also like to thank Vasilis and Jerry for organising and hosting this symposium. I'd like to thank Melanie for her support with the special issue, and Geraldine Leader and Stacy Simplican and their colleagues for being important inspirations for the questions we've posed today. So the symposium you're about to experience will include presentations by authors from the special issue on education as a catalyst for social inclusion for people with disabilities. And these presentations will be in two blocks. The first blocks will include 4 presentations, and then an opportunity for questions, discussions around the content of those presentations. And the second block will include a further 4 presentations with another opportunity for questions, answers and discussions around the content of that block. So, as noted, we're delighted to have Geraldine Leader with us, and Geraldine will offer her reflections on the symposium prior to the close of the session by Professor Melanie, and our symposium is due to end at about 3:45. I just also want to remind everyone that our session is being recorded, and I'd also like to offer a gentle reminder to our speakers in part 1 and part 2 that each presentation has a time limit of 5 minutes. So my colleague Jerry Codina will offer some visual reminders to presenters on this. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Professor Melanie, the Chief Editor of the British Journal of Learning Disabilities, a prolific advocate for inclusion and a leading researcher in the field of learning disabilities, who will now introduce our symposium.
Thank you very much, Debs, and hello everybody. I'm just going to share my screen, that tense moment. Here we go, yay. Okay, so it's lovely to be here, and I have to congratulate you as a guest editor team for putting together such an excellent special issue of the British Journal of Learning Disabilities. I'm only a couple of years into editing the journal, and I edited a methodological journal in education before this one. But it's the British Journal of Learning Disabilities. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to edit it, because in many ways we're at the cutting edge of publishing in our field. The journal has got this long, proud history of working in inclusive ways with people with learning disabilities. It's 50 years old this year, and even from the start, it was challenging things, and the editors were wanting to be progressive and to see the journal as doing progressive things. And the journal has gone from strength to strength, I have to say. But we have a very, very strong ethos in the British Journal of Learning Disabilities. And that ethos really is around nothing about us without us. So this isn't a journal in which academics come together and write about the lives of people with learning disabilities, leaving them as passive objects of our gaze, if you like, the people we write about and interview and watch and comment on. We stand alongside people with learning disabilities and see ourselves much more in the kind of interface between academic life and activism in many ways. And our primary commitment within the journal is to dialogue. We want to have a wide and diverse readership, but we also really want to have dialogue with people with learning disabilities around the work that we're doing. As part of that, one of the initiatives I've brought in was the in response pieces. So we invite people with learning disabilities to respond to articles that get published in the journal and to say, we do or don't like the way you've gone about this. You have or haven't included us fairly. Perhaps if you'd have had somebody with learning disabilities a little bit more involved, your article may have turned out in a different way. So that's an important initiative. We've also got a project going on at the moment, which is exploring how people with learning disabilities can take on meaningful roles as peer reviewers of articles. So before they're published, joining in the review process and shaping articles. And I have to say that that project has come out of the good work of John Paul Donnelly, who's here today, and Barrod and Sunderland People First, who've been really encouraging us to go further in enabling them to have a voice and be involved in the journal. The journal has a splendid editorial board, an executive editorial board, which I'm just giving you a glimpse of here, just to say, although our name is the British Journal of Learning Disabilities, that's because we're published on behalf of the British Institute of Learning Disabilities, and not because we have a UK focus. This is very much an international journal, and it's wonderful to see an international audience for the symposium today. That's really great. Just a word about special issues before I finish my 5 minutes. Special issues are always important to journals. They become a go-to place for people who are passionate about a topic. We actually had two in the year that this one came out. We had one about transitions in the lives of people with learning disabilities as well. But education as a catalyst is absolutely what the journal's about. We want the journal to be educative and to be supporting dramatic moves towards social inclusion. We want to be part of that. So it's great we've got this special issue and the symposium that goes with it. And just to give a little plug, if I can, for the next special issue that comes up in the next issue. This is a celebration of our 50 years of the journal. It's our 50th anniversary year. And we're celebrating that with a special issue, which is about 50 years of learning disability and 50 years of history of the journal and learning disabilities across the world. So the real importance of looking back as well as looking forward. And I'm pleased to say that very many of the papers in that special issue are inclusive papers that are co-produced with people with learning disabilities. So that's my bit from the journal's perspective. I'm delighted to be here, delighted that the special issue was so important and did so well and has generated all of this interest. So I'm going to sit back and enjoy it for a while. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Okay, let me just switch that over. Oh, hang on. Okay, hopefully you can see our presentation. This was the first paper that was published in the journal, and Melanie just mentioned that in response, and this paper was responded to by John Paul Donnelly, who's going to speak after me. So the starting point really is that the researchers, myself, Mary Beaton and Julie Wharton, we were obviously very aware during the pandemic of the increased challenges that were being experienced by many disabled people during the pandemic. But at the same time, we were also hearing some interesting ways that local authorities and school teachers were changing things in schools. We talked a lot during the pandemic about the new normal. And these new normals were people were telling us that they were starting to deepen and broaden social inclusion for people with learning disabilities. We were really fascinated about this, and we thought that this was a phenomenon that needed exploring further. So it was very early on in the pandemic when we did this research. So this is sort of a preliminary piece that we think we'd like to see built on. So we spoke with 4 leaders. They were from the local authority, they were head teachers and a SEND advisor. We also spoke with a young person, Kezia, not her real name, and her parent, Sarah, who contributed to this. And what we were trying to discover was something about the phenomena of decommissioning normal, COVID-19 as a disruptor for school norms for many young people with disabilities. So what we found in our research is that some of the disruptors were beginning to alter the balances of power for children and their families, and beginning to alter the connectedness and the relationships with professionals that were beginning to see examples of deepening social inclusion. So to put some meat on the bones and what that actually means, we found examples of students' agency beginning to change. So one of the head teachers that we spoke to, she described how using Teams links, Zoom links, online platforms was allowing children with selective mutism to find their voice and participate through the chat function in a way that those young people had never participated. And what the teachers and the peers of these children were finding was that this was deepening everybody's understanding of these pupils, and that was deepening their social inclusion. And the head teacher said to me, this is something we want to keep on. We never thought that this kind of media would be useful in this way, but we don't want to stop hearing these young people's voices in this way. And so that's a practice they're continuing. We also heard, and this was from Kezia and Sarah, that children, and we were talking to children with disabilities, had high levels of digital competence. And children's high levels of digital competence often actually exceeded the digital competence of their teachers and their teaching assistants. And this had a strange effect on altering the balances of power between young people and adults, and again, deepened their social inclusion. The particular example that we wrote about was actually a transgressive act. And for those of you that have read Julie Allen's work, you might be familiar with her writing about, from a Foucauldian perspective, children's transgressive acts. So what actually was happening here was that Kezia was communicating to her mum and to the school that she didn't like science and something wasn't working about it. And she was communicating this by just deleting the Zoom links that school was sending to her. And she was picking out the science. And that starts the conversations about what's going wrong with science, how can we improve it? And again, just giving a different voice. And we thought that was very interesting. Moving on to curriculum and pedagogical support. Sarah, Kezia's mum, was, again, we were very aware that parents were taking on a huge amount of learning at home, teaching at home. And Sarah was able to see about Kezia's artwork. And she was able to see how the balance of the teaching assistant and Kezia was working, and actually how Kezia wasn't getting the opportunity to do quite as much of the artwork as was showing off her full talents. And so that led to a conversation between the school and Sarah that led to Kezia actually being entered for her GCSE art, which wasn't going to happen previously. So these deeper parental insights, and it just gives me great pleasure to say that we found out after we published this article that Kezia achieved a grade 5, which is a B/C in her GCSE art, an action that actually wouldn't have happened if this deepening of parental insight through the pandemic hadn't occurred. The other thing that, thank you. The other thing we heard about in terms of deepening partnerships with parents and carers was around parents and carers getting online information, feeling more comfortable entering school parents' evenings by being online. Also, this increased the capacity of professionals to interact because they weren't having to travel. So therapies went online, and actually the timeliness of education healthcare plans increased because more people were able to attend meetings, and that also deepened social inclusion. So in terms of my final points, as the SEND consultant said to me, Jerry, the genie's out of the bottle. This is not going back in now. We need to keep these things and hold on to them. So in terms of what are the implications for education? Well, we need to keep developing the innovative practice established during the pandemic, which deepened and broadened social inclusion, changed power balances, and improved the timeliness of review and stakeholder involvement. And my final point is a reminder of how fast we made these changes, and just a call out, radical systematic change and systemic change can happen if the need exists and if we want it to, because we saw it happen. So my call out is let's make more radical systematic change happen. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing this one with a bit of luck and start sharing the next presentation. Have I stopped sharing? No, nearly. There we go. Right. Okay, I'm going to hand over now to the next presenters. Oh, John Paul, thank you very much. John Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. So, my name is John Paul Donnelly. I'm 38 years old. I have numerous health problems, plus I also have a learning disability. I first learned about an organisation called GDA, which stands for Glasgow Disability Alliance, nearly 6 years ago. It's an organisation that is run by and for people with all types of disability. GDA strives to empower disabled people to become leaders in their own lives, communities and wider society. GDA offers a wide range of learning opportunities which are fun, free and fully accessible. During lockdown, GDA offered its members a chance to continue these opportunities through online programs such as music, learning a new language to fitness, meditation programs, etc. They also kept in touch by phone to see how all their members were coping in lockdown, as a lot of GDA members were in shielding. which was difficult, especially if you lived alone. My brother and sister and I, who are also members, were lucky as we were bubbled together, making children a little bit easier for us all as we had one another. My sister was first approached by GDA to join Self-Building Our Lives. This was due with the advocacy project, plus it was also due to her having a not so much successful dealing with support workers, which sadly didn't work out for her due to bad experience with them. My sister is a very nervous person, so she asked me to help her. So in 2019, both my sister and I were offered the opportunity to go down to London to a conference where we met Alex Kelly, who's a student from Dundee who was part of the Self-Building Lives study. She suggested we agreed with the rest of the group to write a paper on belonging and not belonging to society. It was interesting to find out from other people with disabilities their views and experience on the positive and negative side of living in their communities, example, clubs closing down, hate crime, etc. It was during the first lockdown, Melanie and Nan asked Alex if anyone in the group would be interested in taking part in writing a review for a book called Peter and Friends by the amazing Steve Hardy. My sister and I agreed, but we weren't sure if it was about how people with disabilities were coping with COVID, the illness, or how they were coping with government restrictions. But it turned out to be the whole package, i.e. the fear of the illness to the loss of the care support if they had any will as the government restrictions. I worked alongside with a Dr. Hannah McPherson, and she helped me by asking me lots of questions about the positive and negative side of COVID. I would give her my answers and she would take them up, my answers, and send them back to me for approval. GD were also there to support me and help me with this project. It was in summer 2021, Mel contacted me and asked me if I would like to do my own article as an independent journal. She gave me 4 various subjects to look at and asked me to pick one. I chose the decommissioning normal COVID-19 as a disruptor of school norms for young people with learning disabilities. The reason I chose this option was, although this was based in England, there wasn't anything about Scotland in it. I knew this option was going to be difficult as all the schools were closed, which meant I couldn't get any information I needed from the appropriate education members. So due to the lack of information available, I had to rethink the article. I decided to see how I would have coped in this situation if this happened to me while I was in school 20 years ago. COVID-19 was bad for most people, but for young people with learning disabilities, it was difficult for them. I believe it affected them more as some didn't understand what was going on, not being able to go to school, colleges, clubs, or other organisations. They became isolated and some had to shield due to being on the vulnerable list. Others who had support workers were left with limited support or none from organisations as most places were closed. People were left feeling scared and alone as they were not able to physically see family and friends due to social distance and isolation. All they had to depend on were phone calls on Zoom, although Zoom could be a problem for some as they found it difficult to cope. When I did it, I was like, how am I meant to cope with Zoom? But GD were there all the way, plus the downside to that was not everyone had a device or connection to be able to connect to access Zoom. But GD were delighted to become one of the Scottish Government's first pilot communities for the Connecting Scotland project, which helped provide devices, internet access, and coaching people to feel confident going online, using Zoom, etc. I even surprised myself with various online courses that I've done. For example, I even taught an art class on Zoom, learned a new language, etc. All the Zoom classes arranged by GDA made it slightly easier to cope with the social distance, isolation, and the fear of catching COVID. Today's life is slowly getting back to some form of normality, but a lot of people I know, including myself, are still very wary, scared, and going back to clubs or events in fear of catching COVID. Hopefully this will pass with time, but I think it's a gradual process as we have been used to wearing masks, using hand sanitizers, and keeping social distance. COVID affects people's mental health so much with the NHS being under so much pressure. It is difficult to find help and how to deal with your fears, feelings due to the long waiting list, which is not helpful for someone who is desperately begging for help.
More minute, John Paul. Thank you.
someone asked me, would I write another piece regarding how live my life with disability? The honest answer is, I don't know, but I suppose it would depend on the subject I was talking about or living through. My family always says I have a voice, so use it for what you believe in, and I intend to use, hoping that it will help others. Is it important but not essential for people with disability response to the paper for the journal? The answer is yes. As it helps them to have ability to raise awareness and let their opinions and voice be heard. Plus, it's a learning curve for others who read or listen to someone's opinions. It gives an understanding of what it's like to see the world through the eyes of someone who doesn't see well black and white, through the experience, and be able to understand what it's like to feel scared, isolated, and not understand why you are not allowed to with family and friends through no fault of your own. So the summary of this experience has taught me anything. It is not to take people for granted. The last 2 years have shown me that friends that I used to meet prior to COVID at GD events and other organisations I went to, and who sadly are no longer with us. At the time of the first lockdown, I was thinking, it's okay, I'll catch up with them in the next event. And then you find out they've passed away either to COVID or another illnesses. It makes me feel angry, and I feel cheated as I wasn't able to say goodbye to them due to restrictions. I feel like most people, I have been robbed of precious times that I would have spent with them, and that hurts. The only positive thing to come out of COVID is that we now appreciate our time with family and friends, and hopefully we have become more caring and understanding community. If the last 2 years have taught us anything, hopefully it is, as a society, we have a better understanding of how people who are vulnerable or are disabled have managed to cope and live through COVID, and also finding new flexible ways to stay connected through Zoom. Over the last 2 years, COVID has given us the insight on how important it's become for the voices of young, old, vulnerable, and people living with disabilities to be heard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John-Paul. Thank you. Shall we move to the next presentation, please, as our time is very, very limited. Michelle Bonatti and Elga Adriana, please.
Hello, my name is Michelle Bonatti. I'm assistant professor of teacher education at the State University of New York in Plattsburgh in the US. And I'm joined here today with my colleague, Elga Adriana. She is a lecturer at Gadjah Mada University in Indonesia. We're going to share briefly our paper, Amplifying Children's Voices Within Photo Voice, Emerging Inclusive Education Practices. I'm going to start just by sharing some brief contextual information about education for students with learning disabilities in Indonesia. So inclusive education is being developed for the first time in Indonesia. In the past, children with learning disabilities were mostly excluded from regular schools, but now some schools are welcoming these students. Our study focused on 2 such schools in the Yogyakarta region of Indonesia, 1 high school and 1 primary school. Supporting social inclusion is important for students with learning disabilities who have been excluded from participating in school and their communities. We will talk about a research method called photo voice that can be used to support social inclusion in schools. We'll also discuss our findings of how photo voice can be used to understand how students with learning disabilities think and feel about social inclusion, their communities, and belonging. Photo voice is a qualitative participatory methodology that we implemented with 31 students with learning disabilities and without disabilities in projects that were connected with their school curricula that focused on the overarching themes of social inclusion, belonging, and community. The students served as co-researchers, which involved taking photographs and thematically analyzing them during individual interviews and group discussions. The project culminated with a public photo exhibition and presentations by the students. Data collection occurred over 6 weeks in the 2 schools, and further cross-case analysis of the data were conducted by myself and with Elga. The research question examined was as follows. How do students with and without disabilities perceive social inclusion, belonging, and their community during a photo voice project in Indonesia? Next, Elga will present our findings and conclusions.
Thank you, Michelle. I will continue with the findings. There were 3 themes emerged from the students' photographs, which cover the focus of the findings based on those most relevant to the research question. The 3 themes are inclusive characters, cultural and civic engagement in the community, and self-determination. One theme from the primary school students was inclusive characters. The students attributed their representation of social inclusion, belonging, and community with specific persons or characters of being included and including others. For example, one of the primary students with learning disabilities focused his photos on characters at traditional market who supported his sense of belonging in the community. This student was well known at the market as many waved and smiled at him during the visit and in the photos he took. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, peers without disabilities talked about photos of teachers sitting with students, helping them with their lessons. They view teachers as caring. School is like family, promoting friendship and respect to students who are different from you. Additionally, high school students with and without disabilities identified a variety of issues within the community. The students were developing self-determination to create social change by developing skills to research how to address those issues. Next slide, please. To conclude, Photo Voice provided opportunities to amplify the voices of students with learning disabilities to express their experiences and perspective of social inclusion. Photo Voice methodology can provide a pedagogical tool within inclusive education practices that can address curriculum and support students with diverse needs. Students also develop a sense of agency to transform the community in which they belong. Developing self-determination should be a priority for teachers, as higher levels of self-determination of students with learning disabilities have been found to be predictive of improved community access and employability. And the last slide, please. That's the end of our brief presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Michelle and Elga. So we now move to the last presentation for this first part, and it's Anders, Christian, and Jan. I will not pronounce your surnames because it's very difficult.
I think you should try. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to what we think we have identified as some kind of a hidden curriculum in upper secondary school for students with learning disabilities. This is not so much about what could catalyze inclusion, it's rather about a vicious circle in upper secondary school that is affecting the transition to after school years. The slide disappeared, I think.
Very.
Could you share once more?
Apologies, I couldn't see it, but maybe you could, which is why I just took it down. Let me just try that one more time for you.
Yeah, I saw it.
Oh, did you? Oh, that's good. I apologize.
Yeah, we could see it, yeah.
It's just my computer then. Let me try again.
Thank you.
I think I'm experiencing a bit of a technical problem. I've just got the blue wheel going round on my machine. I apologize. There's not much. It's just crashed. I'm taking down PowerPoint. Okay, so bear with me. I'm going to try again.
Should you try to give me the possibility to share?
That might be a good idea, Vasilis.
I will try to share my screen if that's okay. Let me share my screen.
Okay. I think mine might be coming back. Let's see who.
Yeah. Then you can move on to the second slide.
Thank you very much. Hang on, I've got everything flashing up here.
Okay. So this is about hidden curriculum and vicious circles. And it's not an original empirical study, but rather an attempt to make sense of a set of observations that we did in a couple of studies during the last 5 years in upper secondary schools in Norway. The first observation is actually rather general, that extremely few people with intellectual disabilities are employed or in employment measures. So the post-school outcomes are rather poor. But we also did some kind of rethinking from the earlier studies with the purpose of understanding what was going on and what could possibly explain such poor outcomes. And part of it was that studies of employer attitudes suggested that the outcome shouldn't really be that poor. So the set of observations we started with was from upper secondary school. One was an interview with the headmaster, where we're going to interview him about intellectual disabled people in his school. And he started out with, well, I'm not sure what you mean by intellectual disability. Are you talking about the guests who was visiting the upper secondary school before going back to community services? Another example was an educational authority that was asked to join in on an initiative with matching employers and upper secondary school students. And they responded that, well, that doesn't fit our mandate. We want to ensure that your education is oriented towards a realistic final competence. And the word realistic is some kind of clue here. And I probably don't have time to go into the other examples, so I think we switch to the next slide. But it's examples of the same kind, which meant that we tried to make sense of what is going on here. And the vicious circle we think we have identified, if we start at the top. The first factor is firstly that very few students are employed after leaving school. The majority receives daycare services and some are in sheltered employment. But it's also the fact that the social security system has established a fast track to disabilities pension for young people with intellectual disability. Normally, there's a mandatory around that all employment measures should be exhausted before you get a disability pension in Norway. But intellectually disabled people are exempted from that. And from 2015, that applied to all intellectually disabled people, not just those with a severe disability. And these two facts from labor market participation and the social security system sends a clear message to the schools about what to expect from post-school life for students with intellectual disabilities. And these expectations of poor post-school outcomes affects the school's ambitions of what is realistic. That is, it affects the ambitions for learning, the educational ambitions. It affects the ambitions for post-school employment, post-school's outcomes, but it also affects what is sort of the mission of the school, and that is having a good time while you're still on, while you're in upper secondary education. These very low ambitions are out of keeping with the educational policy, and it's out of keeping with the parental attitudes or the parental ambitions. The fourth point is that in Norway, you have no national curriculum for students with special education or intellectual disabilities. The idea is that each person should have an individualized curriculum with individualized tailoring of the education, which is a very good idea, but also an idea that might have the side effect that it leaves the door wide open for slipping on goals and ambitions. And that's what parents tell us that is actually taking place. It's a copy paste from earlier plans. It's plans not in keeping with the needs of the students, etc., etc. And there was a lot of examples of individual education plans actually not or transferring from being individual tailoring into some kind of realism tailoring. And that's what we will call the hidden curriculum of the upper secondary school I lost that. The last part of it, learning to be realistic, is actually not about our study, but that we can see from other studies that students change their mind from refusing a disability identity to sort of adapting to the realism of the schools during those 3 years in upper secondary education. And the same goes for their parents. So the next slide is very brief. What would be the implications of this? It will be sort of to try to break out of this type of vicious circle, this hidden curriculum. At the policy level, to replace the open door to Social Security and to replace the open door to low ambitions, that is to have some kind of national curriculum. And at your educational level, it is mainly about, you're a bit too quick now. It's mainly about the reorientation and that the individual educational plans have to be sort of changed into what they were intended for. And very briefly, this is the accessible summary of our article, and I'm not going to say much about that because that's about what I've said so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. Thank you. And that's the end of the first part of the presentations.
Lovely, thank you. So I'm going to talk to you today about a project that I did with Debs and with Jerry, where we looked at supported internships. So you might well be wondering what on earth supported internships are. These are a programme that kind of developed in America and have since been adopted in England as the kind of main programme for supporting young people with SEND into employment. So they're specialised programmes. They usually last for around a year for people aged 16 to 24. They're typically unpaid. And usually they have a kind of three parts to them. The first part includes education, and they will do basic college courses on numeracy and literacy. They'll also do stuff on life skills and employability skills. And they do work experience. To help them do the work experience, they have what's called a job coach. So in a supported internship, a job coach works with the young people to support them to learn from work placements and to make a positive progression into paid employment after the internship. And that's regardless of the level of support that's required by the young person. Job coaches are trained to recognise when and how to provide support to the young people, when to increase, decrease or remove in support and to encourage independence. Crucially, they're really good at what's called breaking down tasks into systematic instruction. So you break tasks down into little components and they learn each component at a time. So what did we actually do? Well, there's a supported internship that's been running for at least 5 years in the Midlands in England, which is not far from where we're located in Derby. And I'd encountered them through some other work we were doing. So I got in touch with their job coach and asked if I could come and spend a day with them and talk to the interns that were doing the supported internship at that point in time, talk with the job coaches, talk to some of their colleagues, and some people who are currently employed in the organisation that had already moved through the internship. So the organisation is a really large private sector organisation. It's got a lot of different departments in it. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we collected all this data from having some fantastic conversations with lots of different people. And we did thematic analysis on it using Braun and Clark's approach. So what did we actually find out? There were 3 themes that came out really strongly in the data. The first theme was about positive self-concept and how interns and graduates developed that during the course of the supported internship. So there were accounts of how the supported internship had helped the young people develop their self-confidence, not just in the particular roles they were doing, but socially as well. And socially, not just with their colleagues, but socially outside of work. It made them feel more self-efficacious, and it made them feel much more self-determined. They had much stronger self-belief in what they could do within the workplace and what they could do outside of the workplace. So the theme also held accounts of how feedback had been experienced by interns and graduates, and that was in particular a really strong catalyst for the development of more capability-oriented self-concepts. And there was a clear differentiation between the interns who were sort of in the first half of their internship and the graduates who had left and were working, in terms of how they talked about themselves. There was a transition from being a little bit hesitant about, yes, I can do this, to really being able to describe their key skills and strengths. The second theme was about interpersonal self-concept pathways to inclusion, and these were demonstrated by colleagues who stressed the importance of acknowledging the individual as opposed to categorising them as disabled or special needs. There were expressions of mutual respect offered by colleagues, so strong indications of reciprocity. And colleagues reported on how they had learned to see interns as capable individuals who really contributed in a really important way to the work that needed to be done. The third and final theme really spoke to the practices and policies and culture of the organisation that fed into how those things had actually manifested. And there were a few things that the organisation and the people working there actually did that helped make this. So first of all, colleagues and job coaches worked actively to repress stereotypes. There was a really strong focus on thinking about people individually, a really strong personalised approach. Secondly, something that was really important was that interns received a lot of informal and formal feedback from the job coaches, but also from the colleagues. So they had really, really high expectations placed upon them, and they were expected to behave appropriately, master the tasks, and engage and do really well. And when they did those things, they got a lot of feedback. The focus on contribution and capability, so the high expectations, along with feedback systems, was strongly related to increased confidence in the interns. For the graduates, this resulted in a development of wide range of employability, career and technical skills. Next slide, please. So what did we actually learn? In terms of how the kind of education actually catalyses inclusion, it's really important to have high expectations and then put in place practices and a culture that enables them to enact their capabilities. Participation in expanding sites was made accessible by the supported internship. Positive self-concept helped facilitate participation, and that was made accessible by the supported internship. The experience of the SI placement had also helped interns to understand their difficulties or challenges and how those could be managed practically in professional life. So they were learning to think about how to do things differently. And the key things which made all of that possible were the person-centred approach of the whole organisation, that's from top all the way down to the bottom, but in particular the job coach, who was incredibly good at liaising between colleagues who may have been initially hesitant and encouraging them.
1 minute, Jill.
In terms of implications for educationalists, we learned that it's important to focus on capabilities and have those high expectations, and then provide them with feedback so they can continue to work towards them. That does need to be balanced with a personalised approach and support from a trained professional such as a job coach. Organisations and their employees need to be disability aware and focused on unique differences and a person-centred approach to support reciprocity. As the young person's self-concept increases in positivity, encourage them to engage in a wider range of public sites. And last but not least, parent-carer anxieties are really important. So in SIs, they're included in the programme, they're brought in regularly throughout this so they know what's happening. And that helps them feel much more calm about their young sons or daughters, children, actually being in a workplace and making that progress. That's it.
Thank you very much, Jill. That's fantastic. Vasilis, I think I might leave you to screen sharing. I think I'm experiencing technical difficulties. So if we move on to the next presentation now, which is presentation 5. From Hannah and Jill and Lewis. I've got it. I just hardly dare share it.
Yeah, I'm trying to share it now.
Thank you.
That's coming through. Thanks, Vasilis.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Hannah Blake from the University of Derby. My colleague Jill, who you've just heard from, I also helped on this paper today. I'll take the 5 minutes and give Jill a bit of a break after her session. So the paper that I'm going to talk about today is one that was surrounded by the subject of creating an alumni network for people with learning disabilities and how we go about that in ensuring that they have effective transitions into employment and future destinations post-16. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the paper emerged from undertaking a piece of commissioned research for the West Yorkshire Combined Authority, who wanted a series of resources and training to be developed to help schools and colleges in the area to create and sustain an inclusive SEND alumni network. And to enable the training and resources to be developed, we thought it was first very important to be able to do some research first and conduct that with relevant individuals to understand their thoughts, feelings and experiences of alumni networks. So to do this, we worked with the Combined Authority and we liaised with a number of schools and colleges and conducted 7 focus groups with school leadership teams, SENCOs, teaching assistants, careers leaders, and also with some students with learning disabilities, as we thought it was really important to hear their voices as part of this research as well. And the research also took place in a range of schools and colleges across West Yorkshire, so it included your mainstream schools and sixth forms, as well as specialist schools and colleges. And from then conducting this research, we were able to design and develop a range of free to access resources which are available on the Future Goals website. And individuals were also invited to come along to some training webinars which were held. Next slide, please. So what did we learn from conducting this research? Well, first of all, we learned that although these schools and colleges didn't know much about alumni networks or how to build them, they were really eager to talk to us and learn about what they could do in the future to develop an alumni network. And so part of one of the findings that we gained was that alumni networks can be used to bring people together. So regardless of their abilities of individuals' abilities, it can act as a way to boost aspirations, motivations, and self-esteem. And through current students being able to interact with past students who share similar interests and backgrounds and abilities, and being able to see what these individuals have achieved was seen as a significant benefit to the students. And this could be something as simple as, you know, understanding how to read a bus timetable and catch a bus to a volunteering experience or a placement or a job, which is something that can be really big for these individuals. And secondly, that something that's really important was that, you know, faith needs to be given to the individuals with learning disabilities in their capabilities post-60. So it's found that it's often the people surrounding these young people that's holding them back, and rather than the young person themselves. And by having an enabler and having buy-in by schools and colleges, this sort of encourages and supports, you know, building an alumni network. And a significant finding was the importance of involving engaging parents. So participants in the research saw this parents as potentially the biggest issue in their children progressing or not progressing post-16 and entering, you know, the big wide work, be it employment or volunteering or group work.
1 minute.
Thank you. And the participants believed it would be beneficial to bring these parents of the current students together and bring them together with the parents of past students and discuss the worries and talk through these challenges that are being faced by the parents, to show that, you know, it is scary, but, you know, the support systems are still available and accessible post-16. And finally, something that was stressed throughout the research by numerous people was the importance of ensuring alumni networks are inclusive and not highlighted as something that is special for individuals with special educational needs and learning disabilities, and that these individuals are not treated differently from their peers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hannah and team. Handing over now to Geraldine, Ger and Alison. Vasilis, are you okay to screen share? Thank you. I'll give you that 1 minute.
Can you see it? Can you
Yes,
see it?
yes, we can, Vasilis, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. We're very pleased to be here this afternoon to talk to you about a study we did on transition stories and collecting the voices of school leavers with intellectual disabilities. Next slide, please. Oh, could you work your way down through all of those sections, please, Vasilis? Sorry. Thank you. Thanks. So the background to this study is concerned with the right to full participation in all aspects of human life as set out in the conventions, the UN conventions. And our study examines supported transition to further education, training and employment from a social justice perspective. So as has been previously mentioned this afternoon, it's consistently noted in the literature and in census returns, the reality that people with intellectual disabilities have the lowest participation rates in further education, training and employment, and that's no different in the island of Ireland. Young people with intellectual disabilities do have the same dreams and aspirations, and in their article Disability and Choice, the dilemmas of young people's transitions to further and higher education in Ireland, the authors note that 25% of young people with intellectual disability in 2013 would leave school with no access to further education, training or day services when they leave school. However, little or no formal transition planning takes place in Ireland, although the National Council for Special Education suggests that this is looked at 2 years before leaving school. There's no formal planning that replicates, for example, education and healthcare plans. The model of supported transition that we investigated places, as has been said before, the young person at the centre of the process. So the Walk Peer, and Peer stands for Providing Equal Employment Routes. This programme is a supported transition model which was initiated through the 2012 European Social Disability Activation Project to provide people with disability with appropriate progression, education and development opportunities. But in summary, there is a vicious circle as identified earlier by Jan, and it's very much present in the lives of young people with intellectual disability in Ireland. Next slide, please. So we interviewed 31 young people aged between 16 and 21 years who had engaged or were engaged with the Walk Peer programme at 2 time points in one school year, in the autumn and in the spring. And what we learned was that this harnessing of their innate strengths really fed into building their future hopes and ambitions, and there was a real sense of development of self-awareness, self-determination and indeed self-advocacy that came out of transition planning. Students were more certain about their future prospects, and when I say both positively and negatively, there was a real awareness of the opportunities that perhaps they were being prevented from enjoying, and this came out very strongly in the younger cohort of students. Probably because having observed their older peers, the students in the year above them, having seen them going out on work placement and coming back and not in school uniform, but in their ordinary clothes, it gave them a greater sense of what was possible. So our findings really supported the idea that supported transition programs can provide young people with the information, the options, the confidence, and the skills to successfully transition into a variety of pathways. And these highly structured support programs and transition planning can help young people to realise their goals. Next slide, please.
1 minute, Alison.
Thank you. So I'm going to take over now. So basically, what are the implications? Well, the implications are really underpinned by the old notion even of mentoring, but yet which we still forget about. And really this relationship between the career and employment facilitator really allowed and enabled the young person to explore their aspirations. As a result of that, then their expectations were raised, not only theirs, but also their parents. And that came up there earlier in another presentation. In doing this, then they develop pathways, and they actually make these situations real for these young people. So they're actually going, I've got work experience. Some of them have got employment. And what's really critical here is the sustainability part. The sustainability part is supported by the career and employment facilitator by being a sounding board for this young person for basically as long as they need it. What underpins that then? Access, choice, which leads to active citizenship. Next slide, please. So really, when we look at this, the model around ecological pathways, it really shows us the importance of interpersonal relationships within education and how just one person can raise those aspirations of these young people and enable them to be actively engaged in their local communities as well as the wider communities. And I suppose from the perspective of the theme that's running through here in some of the presentations, it really is about recognising and respecting their right to work and to access employment. And the last slide, please. So this takes us through then to the whole notion of transition and how supported transition needs to be seen from a longitudinal perspective. What you're seeing there on the screen is the current government policy that they are trying to develop in Ireland. And what you're seeing on top is how the Walk Peer supported model of transition can actually facilitate that. As a result of this, what has been announced is the government has committed €500,000 to the development of rolling the programme out across 10 schools in Ireland. And we are going to act as the people who are going to develop this longitudinal strategy around transition and the importance. So from our perspective, the research has really impacted on this notion of how education really can be a catalyst for these young people. And we were very privileged and delighted to be able to be part of the special edition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ger and Alison, really appreciated. Handing on to our last presentation by Anne-Marie. I think, Anne-Marie, you're going to share your own PowerPoint.
Now, can everybody see that? Did it come up?
Fingers crossed. Yes, thank you.
Great, great. Good afternoon, everyone. It's been a really interesting afternoon and listening to the work of people who've been undertaking a diversity of topics, really. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to present our project called Don't Mention the Diet. The team includes Sheila Devan, Sandra Toomey, Lucia O'Neill, Joseph McCarthy, Caroline Egan, Caroline Dalton, Maria Capeless and I. The focus of this project was on increasing knowledge around a healthy lifestyle to support lifestyle decision making. As a consequence of their participation in this project, the co-designers had increased opportunities for social inclusion. However, we hope that our ongoing work on this project will support the inclusion of people with intellectual disabilities in general through participation in the module and the development of knowledge and skills as a result. More broadly, we continue to highlight the importance of considering the accessibility of health promotion and education materials for the inclusion of people with intellectual disability that may benefit other groups in society as part of a broader universal design approach. This project came about when people with intellectual disabilities voiced their frustrations at being told that they needed to go on a diet, but they didn't understand why. They did not know or understand the link between diet and physical or overall health. Therefore, we worked together to design and co-produce this educational module. We used a collaborative patient and public involvement approach to integrate the knowledge and experience of the team members in designing and delivering a health promotion module that educated and empowered the learners around lifestyle decision making. The team includes 3 adults with a mild or a moderate intellectual disability and 5 intellectual disability nurses. 4 of those nurses are lecturers in the School of Nursing and Midwifery here in UCC in Cork, and 1 works as a clinical nurse specialist in communication in Cope Foundation, which is the local disability service provider. This project resulted in the design of an 8-month module with a double helix structure that intertwines both educational and personal development elements. The module did not set out to support people with intellectual disability to achieve healthy weight or support them on a diet. Rather, the purpose was actually to equip the students with information and knowledge to make informed decisions regarding diet and food choices. Teaching involved adopting multisensory approaches that supported the students to actively experience their learning rather than passively receive content. Supporting the personal development of each student was an important element that was threaded throughout the 8 months. Specific emphasis was placed on self-awareness, self-identity, self-confidence and decision-making. The module pace and progression was determined by the students' feedback and their learning. This feedback was critical to ensuring the efficacy and the accessibility of the module. And the students who did complete it enjoyed the person-centered and interactive approach of the module. So this project did catalyse the social inclusion of people with intellectual disability. The PPI approach itself brought the co-designers into the world of health promotion design, team working with us in UCC, and it expanded their networks in general. We all benefited from the opportunity to work together as equal members of the team. Now that COVID restrictions are easing, plans are underway for the co-designers to share their experiences of health promotion and this project with undergraduate nurses in UCC. And at the end of this month, Lucia and I are giving an oral presentation at a conference on the benefits of PPI working. Similarly, the group have shared their experiences with peers, with local advocacy groups, and as part of the Lifelong Learning Festival here in Cork City.
1 minute, Anne-Marie.
These are opportunities that may not have come about if the group didn't become involved in this project. The project has also had implications for us as educationalists that probably have wider application. Listening to the self-identified health education needs and responding collaboratively resulted in an educational initiative that met students' needs. Adopting a PPI approach was key here. It was the fundamental way of designing the resource so it held relevance, met the needs of the learners, and was fit for purpose. The double helix approach that we used provided an opportunity to support learners' personal development as well as meeting their needs. It is also quite practical and replicable. I would like to thank you all for listening. If anyone would like to contact us, we are happy to discuss this in more detail. My contact details are on the slide. We also developed a video abstract for anyone who is interested in viewing it on the British Journal of Learning Disabilities YouTube channel, or it's on the webpage with the article itself as well. And I welcome any questions or comments that you may have in the Q&A session.
I really would like to hand over now to Geraldine Leader, who's going to bring our closing reflections together and a summarisation of how those presentations feel from Geraldine's perspective.
Thank you very much. And I first want to thank Deborah and her team. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. And I mean, I think the work I've heard today and your publications in a special issue are absolutely so interesting, and I'm just delighted to see them because there's so much synergy in my own work. But before I comment on the papers, Deborah asked me just to give you some background on our social inclusion paper that I wrote with Stacy back in 2015 and where it came from and the genesis and the idea of our model. And Stacy, who can't be with us today, was a postdoctoral fellow who came to my lab back here in Galway back in 2014. And she was on a fellowship that was sponsored by the University of Michigan, whereby she spent a year in Michigan working with collaborators of mine there. And then she came to Ireland to work in my lab. And the idea was that we would have a joint project between Michigan and Ireland. So my background is I'm a psychologist, and I work here in the School of Psychology and the Irish Centre for Autism and Neurodevelopmental Research. So that's my background. And Stacy is a political scientist. So when Stacy arrived at my doorstep, I was wondering, what am I going to do with Stacy? And we found an area in which we're interested in the whole area of social inclusion. And around that time in Ireland, the landscape was, we had the report of moving from congregated settings in 2010, and service providers were reconfiguring and moving into the community. And Stacy and I used to go for coffee in a hotel close by, and we very often would pass a service provider, a day service provider, and they would be maybe having a coffee in a hotel where we were having lunch. And I observed to Stacy that one day we saw two care workers, let's just say key workers, with a person with a learning disability, and they were having a coffee together, but there was no interaction with the person with intellectual disability. So I posed the question to Stacy, is that social inclusion? Is that participating in the community, being present but not participating? So that started our journey around social inclusion. And I asked Stacy, what is social inclusion? How do you define it? And then we looked at the literature, and the problem was we couldn't define it because there were so many different definitions of social inclusion. Each definition was looking at a different part of social inclusion. So we spent about 6 months meeting once a week, reading the literature, reflecting on the literature, and talking a lot. We did a lot of talking. And after all that talking, we came up with the model of the two central concepts of social inclusion have to be interpersonal relationships and, of course, community participation. So within that work, it was very important for us to define different levels of interpersonal relationships and community participation. So I suppose the community, I feel, was the most important one, because that was the one that was probably least researched. And we defined the different levels of community participation, from being present, having encounters, and full participation. So I suppose our goal then as researchers is that in working, that we should always be aiming constantly for full participations and full level of social inclusion, and it should be possible for all. And I suppose it gives a roadmap as well, and it gives an ambitious roadmap of full inclusion for all people with disability. So then within our own work following social inclusion, as we know, and these themes were very much highlighted today, the two major themes of access to education and access to employment. They're the two conduits, or the two ways we can provide full social inclusion, is enabling access to education and employment. And I suppose back in 2014, it seemed like a long time ago, and I do feel we've moved on a lot since then, and we've seen examples of that today. But moving away from tokenism, token employment, we really want full employment, real employment, meaningful employment that provides, proper wages. Again, moving away from that tokenism. And just in terms of my own research, then I like to focus on how do we get there? How can we promote full employment, full inclusive education for all? And I feel there's two big ways, and we've touched on a lot of them today. The first would be through technology. Assistive technology can be that gap in terms of education, access to education and access to employment. And I'm currently, if anybody is interested, running a cost action at the moment. And the cost action, it's CA 19104. And the reason I'm giving it a plug is what we're trying to do in that cost action is to increase the availability of assistive technology to allow access to education and employment for people with disability. So it's called Advancing Social Inclusion Through Technology and Through Empowerment. So technology, assistive technology is a big thing, but if you drill down deeper into assistive technology, of course, the problem is it's not fully available. In Ireland here, it's not available, and worldwide. The stats are something like globally, only 10% of those that need assistive technology actually have access to assistive technology. So there's a huge job of work to do there in terms of looking at our infrastructures, our policies, and how do we make assistive technology, how do we make the match between the technology and the person, how do we make it available. Then the other theme I'd like to highlight is I feel the other way in which we can get to full inclusion, full social inclusion is true. I mean, as a psychologist, I'm very interested in I call them interventions, but any supported programs that again can increase access to education and employment. So I've been involved in a number of projects where, for example, here we designed a curriculum to help people with moderate intellectual disability access employment. So we wrote a curriculum that might do things like money skills, social skills, and we developed that curriculum, or we delivered rather that curriculum in the university here to move it out of the service and to normalize it. And then we followed that in the afternoons with a supported employment placement. So I think any things that we can do to bridge that gap, that's what I feel, how I like to think of my research and my work is, what can I do to bridge the gap, to make employment and education fully accessible? And I feel two great ways are through assistive technology and also through any supportive curriculums or supported interventions that really are enablers. So moving on then to the papers today. I was really inspired by so many of them. The first paper by Mari, and again, I mean, that resonated with me in that, technology is now the new normal, and we should, maybe service providers, we should be thinking about how can we, continue what was normal during the pandemic in terms of increasing accessibility. I'm sure in every country, the availability of services is problematic. I think the new normal digitally through technology may actually increase the availability of services. So that would be a great thing. And I was delighted also, of course, to hear from John Paul and his life during the pandemic. So that was wonderful. Again, the second paper by Michelle and her team. I love the Photo Voice project. Again, using technology. Photo Voice is a form of technology, assistive technology. Again, so powerful in increasing social inclusion. I was really interested by Andre's paper in Norway. I feel, he really hit the nail on the head with his paper and his findings. And I think those findings are relevant in every country. And what struck me from his paper was, which I feel we're not doing, and if we are doing it, I don't think we're doing it well enough, is that employment is transition planning. We did hear further on that we are actually doing it in a small scale in Ireland, but traditionally in Ireland, we have never done transition planning really. I think we think about it after the fact. So the project I described where we did employment, we delivered an employment preparation curriculum and a supportive employment placement, that was done years after school leaving, years and years after. So transition planning with the person obviously at the center of it, I feel that should be happening, very, very early, 14, 15, 16. I feel that's when we should start our transition planning. And also the curriculum, I think we need to look at the curriculum we're delivering. There's huge need to examine curriculums because, is the curriculum, is it going to support life after school? So I think transition planning, both personal planning with the individual and also supported curriculum around that is so very, very important. And then moving on to the final three papers, again, the paper from Jill Hansen and her team, again, it was wonderful to see the work on supportive employment and the very important effects that was having on the individuals. That was wonderful to see. And I just loved Blake's paper on the alumni network. I feel that was just something, to me, simple, but extremely powerful. Something like having alumni network, that support network, and demonstrating to the individual what is possible. I think, to me, that was something that was simple, but so powerful, and something we're not doing probably, and possibly something we should think about. So I loved that. That was absolutely wonderful. And then Scanlon in DCU, I was delighted to see their program, their transition planning program. It would be wonderful that that was available throughout Ireland. It looks like a really promising model, and actually it was what I was thinking about when I was listening to the previous paper. So Ger sort of stole my thunder there. They're my reflections. It was a really wonderful afternoon, and I'd like to also thank all the presenters. You're doing really, really inspiring work, and we gotta keep going with it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Geraldine. Those reflections were so thoughtful. And there's been some other really interesting points coming in the chat as well. I'm pleased to say we're just about on time, so I'm going to hand over to Melanie for the closing remarks.
Thank you. I'll keep them short. What a nice afternoon. Sometimes when I'm on Zoom for the afternoon, I think, oh, good, I can get lots of email done. And sometimes I think, oh, this is going to be a heavy screen time. And this afternoon, I just sat back and enjoyed it and was really stimulated. So it was great. I endorse what you said, Geraldine, about them being inspiring papers, but they fitted together very nicely. And I think that's the power of working together on a special issue, isn't it? That you can forward a theme and pull papers together and say something more than you could say individually as a collective. And the messages I took from this, I jotted down: the power of peers, networks, and building on people's strengths. I thought that they underpinned everything we heard today, that none of these researchers, none of these writers of papers started off with the premise that people with learning disabilities are lacking. They all started with the premise that people have rights and strengths, and we need to work with those rights and strengths to make things happen. So that's what I take from that. And I don't know about you, John Paul, but I thought they were a respectful set of papers, and that if you were responding, you'd probably feel okay about them. Do you want to say anything?
Just want to say a big thank you for being asked to write a paper for the paper, because as I said in my paper, we as a learning disability and having all these health issues, we've got the experience and seeing things as Hamptons. We've been put through barriers like employment, education, things as Hamptons in the past, and things happening just now, especially with COVID. This is Hamptons, and you're like, our voices need to really be heard, and either through mouth or in a piece of paper so people can see it in black and white.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. Yeah, so thanks for inviting us, and thank you to everybody who's taken part.